Okay, I just finished watching Worst Neighbor Ever. It's the latest entry in the whole Worst Blank Ever true crime series, following Worst Roommate Ever and Worst Ex Ever. This is the Leverton Review, where I watch and rate as much as I can on my quest to becoming the most prolific reviewer of all time. And this one came out on July 1st, 2026, with 4 episodes in the first season. All 4 episodes were released at once. And I have to say, this might be one of those series where the title is actually underselling how insane some of these people are. Because these aren't just stories about neighbors who don't get along. These are stories about people who take a neighborhood dispute, a financial problem, or just an opportunity to make money and turn it into something absolutely horrific. The first episode is probably the most traditional worst neighbor story. It's about Frances Zaire, who was invited to stay with a couple, Shauna and David Scott, while she was going through a difficult period in her life. She was eventually asked to leave and she moved into a house across the street. And that's where things got really bad. Instead of simply moving on, Frances became increasingly obsessed with the people across the street and said that they were harassing her. There were arguments, harassment, racial remarks, accusations, and this growing belief that everybody was somehow against her. And eventually, in 2018, she crossed the line from being a terrible neighbor to becoming a murderer. She entered the Scots' home and shot Shauna in the face, seriously injuring her, and then killed Shauna's husband, David. Frances later pleaded guilty and received a 35-year prison sentence. She clearly had some kind of mental illness. She was obsessed with the fact that she was being persecuted. Her behavior became increasingly disturbing, and she ultimately became extremely violent. And obviously, access to a firearm made the consequences of that violence potentially, well, definitely, much more devastating. That's something the series doesn't really let you ignore. All right, let's move on to the second episode, Midwest Meltdown. Then we get to the episode that is probably the most unbelievable one. It's called Midwest Meltdown, and it deals with the 2012 Richmond Hill explosion in Indianapolis. This one is absolutely insane. A house in a quiet suburban neighborhood explodes. And at first, it looks like some kind of terrible accident. But investigators start noticing things that don't quite add up, like all of the furniture is gone. And that led them to ask more questions. The house belonged to Monserrate Monsi Shirley, and investigators eventually concluded that the explosion was part of an insurance fraud scheme involving Shirley, her boyfriend Mark Leonard, and Leonard's brother Bob Leonard. And this is where the story gets horrifying. The explosion didn't just destroy their house, it devastated the surrounding neighborhood. Dion and Jennifer Longworth, who lived next door, were killed. Dozens of other homes were damaged or destroyed, and there were multiple injuries. Contemporary reports estimated the property damage at around $4 million. And what really struck me about this case is how much evidence the investigators eventually found, all because the house had no furniture in it. The perpetrators had apparently taken steps beforehand that, in hindsight, were incredibly suspicious. They had made arrangements to be away from the house for 3 weekends in a row because they had tried to do this for 3 weekends. They had removed all of their belongings, like I said. There had been previous suspicious activity, and the investigators were able to start putting all of these pieces together. The important thing here is that this wasn't some brilliant criminal mastermind story. It was a terrible plan that caused enormous amounts of destruction and killed two completely innocent people. Like, if it had been a better plan, they wouldn't have got rid of the furniture, and then maybe the investigators wouldn't have found anything. Monty Shirley eventually pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit arson and received a 50-year sentence. Mark Leonard was convicted and sentenced to 2 life sentences without parole, and Bob Leonard was also convicted and received life without parole. Mark Leonard died in prison in 2018. And honestly, the most disturbing part is that this whole thing was supposedly about money. They were willing to risk an entire neighborhood just for an insurance payout. That's just insane. All right, let's talk about the third episode called Fear Thy Neighbor. The third episode is another genuine neighbor nightmare. This one takes place in Oakland, California, and involves Jamal J.T. Thomas and his former neighbors Miles and Milena. Miles and Milena bought what they thought was their dream home, but there was a problem. A man named Jamal had been living in the property next door with his family, and after the property changed hands, he was evicted. Instead of leaving and moving on with his life, he became increasingly obsessed with the new neighbors. And then the harassment started. There were rocks being thrown at the house, windows were broken, and not just randomly, like every day. There were confrontations, there were calls to the police, and the police didn't really help the situation. And the really frustrating thing is that the situation kept escalating. The family was repeatedly asking for help, but the problem wasn't resolved, and they lived right down the street from the police station, which is ridiculous. Eventually, the conflict became deadly. Jamal Thomas murdered Miles Armstead, and Jamal said that he was going to do that. He was later convicted and sentenced to life in prison. And this episode left me with a very uncomfortable question. At what point does a neighborhood dispute become an emergency? Because there's a tendency to think of these things as petty arguments. And Jamal, like the first case, had some kind of mental illness, and this should have been taken much more seriously. Those neighbors don't like each other. Those neighbors are fighting over property. Someone's being annoying. But sometimes you're watching a situation where somebody is clearly becoming increasingly obsessed and with another person and increasingly dangerous. And that's when things can go awry. And I think in this case, it was kind of the fault of the police what happened. All right, the fourth episode, The Executor. And then we get to the final episode, and this is where I started thinking, how is this even a worst neighbor story? Because this one is less about a neighbor dispute and more about an absolutely bizarre fraud scheme. The episode is called The Executor, and it focuses on Caroline Hurling, also known as Carrie Phoenix. She became involved with an elderly man named Charles Wilding. When people became concerned because they hadn't seen Charles for some time, the police eventually conducted a wellness check. And that's when the story starts getting extremely strange. Caroline claimed that she was managing Charles's estate. But investigators began discovering that something was very wrong. There was no legitimate trust in the way that she claimed. Documents had been forged. She had obtained control over assets belonging to other people by forging these documents. And eventually, investigators discovered that Charles was dead, and he had been dead this entire time. His body had been concealed and ultimately disposed of as Caroline and her accomplices attempted to keep the fraud going. The scale of the financial crime was enormous. The Justice Department says the scheme involved almost $3.9 million in fraudulently obtained property and money. And Caroline was eventually sentenced to 20 years in federal prison and ordered to pay more than 3.8 million in restitution. What I eventually found most interesting about this episode was the investigation. The police initially had a missing person situation that became something much more serious. And instead of simply looking at one piece of evidence, investigators started connecting the financial records, the property, the forged documents, and the inconsistencies in Caroline's story. They brought in people with expertise in financial crimes, and eventually the whole thing unraveled. It's a really good example of how complicated financial crimes can become when somebody builds an entire fake reality around them. All right, let's talk about the big question. So, what do I think of Worst Neighbor Ever? Well, I think it's pretty good. I also think the title is a little misleading because the 4 episodes aren't really telling the same kind of story. The first and third episodes are really about dangerous neighbors and escalating feuds caused by mental illness and obsession. The second is essentially an insurance fraud scheme that has catastrophic consequences for an entire neighborhood. And the fourth is basically a bizarre fraud and death concealment story because it's not sure that Charles actually was murdered. A story that happens to involve somebody who lived in the neighborhood, so they're not really bad neighbors. So there's a bit of a worst neighbor ever theme connecting everything, but it's pretty loose. There was also something I kept thinking about while watching these episodes. In the United States, people often have arguments about whether guns themselves are the problem or whether the underlying issue is mental health, crime, poverty, or something else. Yeah, and I think it's usually guns plus something. So in 2 cases, if the mental health aspect of the people had been taken into account, the murders wouldn't have happened because they wouldn't have had guns. In the first story, you have someone whose behavior becomes increasingly disturbing and eventually becomes lethal. In the third, you have an escalating obsession combined with violence. In both cases, the presence of a firearm made an already dangerous situation dramatically more deadly. The lesson, or at least one of them, is that escalating harassment and threatening behavior should be taken seriously before somebody gets hurt, not just like it's a joke or something, like those 2 cases it was treated like. Overall, I thought Worst Neighbor Ever was a pretty fascinating true crime series. Some of the stories are absolutely horrifying. The first and third episodes are probably the ones that feel most like what you'd expect from the title. The second episode is probably the most shocking because of the sheer scale of the destruction. And the fourth, sorry, not the third, but the fourth is probably the strangest. It's also interesting that the series doesn't just focus on the criminals. It spends a lot of time showing how these situations affected the people living around them. And that's probably the thing that makes the series work. Because most of us have neighbors. Most of us have had annoying neighbors. Maybe you've had a neighbor who plays music too loudly. Maybe somebody parks in the wrong place. Maybe somebody has a dog that won't stop barking. But you generally assume that these are just minor annoyances. You don't expect your neighbor to become the center of a murder investigation. And that's what makes these stories so disturbing. They're happening in ordinary neighborhoods. The houses look normal. The streets look normal. The people initially look normal. And then everything goes completely insane. So yeah, if you like true crime, I would recommend Worst Neighbor Ever. I'd give it like a 7 out of 10. It's only 4 episodes, and they're all pretty easy to get through. I'm not sure I'd call it the best of the Worst Ever series, but it's definitely worth watching. And thankfully, I don't have any criminal advice to give you at the end of this one. My only advice is try to get along with your neighbors. Seriously. It's probably safer. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Worst Neighbor Ever. Have you watched it? Which episode did you find the most disturbing? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks and bye. Well, I said that I don't really have any criminal advice to give you, but I am going to give you some criminal advice. Don't be a criminal, but if you're going to be a criminal, maybe don't try to take money from dead people. Don't fake documents saying that you're the executor of their estate, because especially if you're not a lawyer, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And if you're going to try and blow up your house as part of some weird insurance scheme, don't take all your furniture away, because that was the only reason the investigators, figured that there was some kind of crime going on, is because the house blew up without any furniture in it, right? And they weren't moving or anything. No one said that they were moving, so that is weird. All right, if you like what I do, please like, subscribe to the video. I'm trying to get to be the most prolific reviewer of all time, and I don't need YouTube subscriptions to do that, but it definitely helps me stay motivated. Thanks, bye-bye.